Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariash. Thanks for spending some time with us today. If you enjoy our conversation series, make sure you never miss an interview by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our work across the globe. Stumble upon the Twitter account This Used to Be a Synagogue, and you'll find photographs of nondescript street views in Manhattan, with a tweet stating that the address and name of the congregation or organization that used to sit on the site. Click the link in the account bio, and you'll begin to realize that the creator of this project spent a significant amount of time combing through the data archives to find old shul spots, also known as the account's Twitter handle. It turns out the person mapping lower Manhattan addresses that used to be synagogues is University of Texas, Austin Jr., Amy Shreeve. For her, what began as an academic project in something called commemorative geography has turned into a serious effort to delve into the history of Jewish immigration and Jewish life in New York from a bygone era. Amy's work caught our eye, and we're very glad that she's here to discuss what inspired her to explore Jewish New York as it used to be, the importance of religious spaces to a community, and what her plans are for mapping other boroughs and cities. Amy, thanks so much for being here. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Dan. It's really good to be here.
Well, my first question is one that I think a lot of people have. We know This Used to Be a Synagogue stems from a commemorative geography-related course, but why synagogues and why Jewish New York?
Well, Dan, that's a really good question, especially if you know a little bit about me. I am not Jewish, and I've also never been to New York. So, for a lot of people, reading in the JTA article or meeting me, finding out that I did this project sounds a little bit out of left field. But my interest in this started from a very practical place, my courses and my language learning at UT Austin. About a year and a half ago, I started taking Yiddish as my foreign language. As a humanities major, that we are required to take and learn a language during our studies at the university. When I saw that Yiddish was offered, I had no way I could turn it down. I knew that this was a language that had a very deep cultural history, and it was something that I was almost completely unaware of. So after starting to take this class, I didn't only develop an affinity for the language, but also for the culture, both in Eastern Europe and in the United States. My professor of the course, Dr. Itzik Gottesman, had written an article on the Bronx and how many synagogues in the Bronx are now gymnasiums, YMCAs, beauty parlors, and many other things. At the same time, I was taking a course where we were applying digital methods in geography to humanities data, trying to get to the bottom of historical controversies and timelines that may have been forgotten. So I took my newfound love of Yiddish and my longtime love of history and my history courses. I decided to put them together through this project.
Well, I have a special interest in this. Of course, so many Jews in this country, their forebears came to New York first. Some of them stayed, some of them went on to other places throughout the United States. In my case, on my mother's side, our first relative arrived in New York in the 1880s. And then later on, my grandfather came later than that. So I have a special interest, and I'm sure you've had to have heard from so many people who have their roots in Manhattan. But before we get into the meaning of this, where did you find the data needed to develop This Used to Be a Synagogue? And what went into constructing a Twitter bot? And for those of us who are not into coding or not engineering experts, what exactly is a Twitter bot?
Great. So I'll answer that first question, or that last question first. So a Twitter bot is a Twitter page, just like a Facebook page or any other website. But instead of me posting interesting information that I find, it's operated by an automated system, basically a robot. So what this automated system does is every once in a while, I think it's getting less frequent now because I have fewer entries to post, the account will, on its own, spontaneously post a picture of a Google Street View and accompany it with the name and the address of a former synagogue or Jewish organization in New York. And so the necessary components of this are obviously my account, a little bit of coding know how I learned through school, and also a great deal of information that accompanies all of these former synagogues and their addresses. So initially, with this project, I had kind of wanted to do something a little bit bigger in scope, thought maybe the entire United States. But I found that New York was actually extremely unique. Because the Jewish community was so large, especially in the late 19th century, they had to keep very specific and particular records. If you were moving from the old country to the United States and you wanted to find the synagogue where people from your hometown gathered, you'd have to look it up in the New York Jewish Yearbook. Other cities and towns didn't necessarily have such records because the organizations weren't quite as granular. Therefore, the New York Jewish community kept very particular records, and they included addresses, names, years of founding, countries of origin, sometimes even the name of the rabbi and the denomination. And I was very fortunate because the Center for Jewish History in New York went through the trouble and took the liberty of cleaning and clearing up a great deal of this data, making it easy to read, putting it on a map, making a list. And so I used that as a jumping off point to dive into the records myself, to learn how to read them, to learn what they meant. And eventually, I had to give up my lofty project of the entire United States because in Manhattan alone, from the beginning of America with the first New York synagogue way back in the 17th century, all the way up until the Great Depression, over 1,000 synagogues were established in Manhattan. And this was, quite a large group to work with. And so eventually the bot is going to post a little bit every day, a picture of the street as it looks now, or as it looks has looked in the past year. It's going to post the name of the synagogue and the address. This lets people know what used to be there while simultaneously comparing it with what is there right now.
I don't know if you actually ran into our name because B'nai B'rith was founded on the Lower East Side on Essex Street, and it was founded in a cafe. The building wasn't named B'nai B'rith, but it was a group of German Jewish immigrants who came together in that cafe, Sinsheimer's Cafe. Please take a note so we can take a look. We know more or less where the location was on Essex Street, but this is not only because the population was so big and it kept growing and growing as immigrants came in that last, let's say from the 1880s, mid 1880s on into 1920s, the population just grew exponentially in Jewish population in Manhattan. But these weren't only synagogues. There were other organizations. For example, there were Landsmannschaften. There were all of these organizations which were kind of named after the towns or cities that these individuals came from, and that was a way that they would socialize and get together. Talk a little about the length and breadth of what the community was at that time, in addition to the synagogues.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's the second most misleading thing about this project, aside from it being a bit unexpected that I'm the person to complete it, that this used to be a synagogue. Most of them were never synagogues. Like you said, rather, they were Landsmannschaften or other Jewish organizations. So, as you said, Landsmannschaften were generally neighborhood organizations where people from one hometown in Eastern Europe congregated together in New York. And it wasn't always in a synagogue building or space. It could be in a cafe. It could be in somebody's apartment. Often, for things like the High Holy Days, they took the liberty of renting out a space in a gymnasium, even in a school. So there were many different spaces that these organizations congregated in, and the types of organization varied almost exactly as much. Many of them were mutual aid societies, sick benefit societies meant to help sustain the community. Some gathered together so they could put money together to bring their families over to New York. So many of these organizations functioned as support systems for people when they came to New York. They were able to group with people that they knew from their old lives across the Atlantic Ocean and work together. Some of the most interesting organizations that I've seen were bread baking societies, women's reading groups. Many of these organizations had their roots in Masonic or even leftist labor groups. So the types of organizations were extremely varied, and they represent the diversity of both people and ideas in Jewish New York in the 19th and 20th century.
So let's talk about the synagogues, though. Even though you're right, I mean there were a lot of synagogues, and there are very few left, very few buildings left, synagogue buildings on the Lower East Side. But there were synagogues. Um, what did you learn about the not only the history of Jewish immigration to New York, but about the importance of religious spaces to Jewish communities?
I think that the sheer number of synagogues and Jewish organizations is a testament to the importance that religion and culture had in the lives of new immigrants. Going to a new town can be frightening, and moving entire continents even more so. The prevalence of synagogues, especially in the Lower East Side, shows what a comfort and what structure religion provided to many of these immigrants. It also shows us the ways and the different ways people decided to group, how it reflected their cultural and their religious lives back home. For example, you can see in many of the synagogues, people would prefer to hire a rabbi who was a landsman, who was from their same hometown, to kind of replicate the same spirit and to replicate the same patterns of religion that they had experienced in the past. These people treasured not only religion, but religion as they had known it and as they had grown up with it, and they maintained very strong cultural ties. While some people and some immigrant groups who came to the United States were able to quickly assimilate or chose to quickly assimilate, many of these Jewish groups instead chose to hold tightly to the people that they knew and hold tightly to the religion and the customs that they knew. And that is one thing we see, especially in the first generation of immigrants. One of the reasons why we see fewer synagogues on the Lower East Side, aside from the fact that the Jewish population as a whole has decreased in the area, is that initially many people's religious identity was very closely intertwined with their hometown and their religious past. They identified not only as Jews, but Jews from Krakow. And then they had children, and their children had never been to Poland. And while they were still very proudly Jewish, they didn't necessarily hold that same geographical tie. This shows us the ways that religion and place can become very closely associated. And then in future generations, that association might not be as strong, but the religious beliefs and traditions may still be.
I think there's another factor that goes into this too, in terms of the number of places that Judaism is a religion that, while we have synagogues and some of them are quite beautiful, it's not really required that there be a building, and that you can have a service, you can have a minyan in a room in somebody's house, and these shtiblach, these small little prayer rooms, proliferated, I'm sure, and it would many of them probably existed in some of these tenement buildings, I'm guessing. Um, I guess it would be, it's hard to track it, but your point is well taken that the synagogues, such as they were in a way kind of a companion to the Landsmannschaft. That this was a place that they felt comfortable. They were probably praying together with other people from their town, or if they didn't know them, they were from the region. They felt comfortable doing it. So there was, in addition to a religious imperative here, there was also a socialization process going on. It's very hard for us to, we think about how there were these teeming masses of people. It was a very densely packed area, particularly in the Lower East Side, although you didn't map only in the Lower East Side. And it's, we like to imagine sometimes what it was like, but on the other hand, it's very hard for us because that situation doesn't exist today. So your points are well taken. What, after the JTA article, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency article, what kind of interest have you received from the Jewish community around the country, the history department at UT Austin, and others? And has Professor Gottesman continued to work with you on this project?
Yes, I've been very pleased with the responses I've received for this project. when the article came out in July or August, I received a lot of people sending emails telling me that their grandfather had been the rabbi of a particular shul that I had posted, or that they had remembered going there themselves when it was still open. And I was very pleased to see people's general ties and how much that these places meant to them, even though in the past 50 years or so, some of them might have been forgotten. I was also delighted to hear people's stories, poems, and songs about some of these places, and to be able to experience the very rich culture of the time from people who experienced it or had family members who experienced it. Insofar as my experience with the UT History Department, I was able to talk a little bit with the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies here at UT, and that is a very fantastic experience, very wonderful folks there. And I also was able to find out I was working on my history capstone last semester, and the professor I had spoke to me after the history department and the Schusterman Center just put a little thing on their website and mentioned to me that her grandfather had actually been a rabbi at a synagogue in New York. And that was very exciting for me to hear. And I felt very connected and very plugged into kind of both the past and the present at that time. Dr. Gottesman, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, no, go ahead.
Yeah, just to finish it up, Dr. Gottesman and I haven't really been working on this project, but I do look forward to our Yiddish Tish, our Yiddish table meetings every Friday, and continuing to work on my Yiddish education through them.
Let me ask you about Yiddish for a second. Did Yiddish enter into any of the research that you did?
Yes, initially I was very curious about the names of many of the synagogues, but I found that Yiddish didn't factor into them as much as I thought. Obviously, many of them have Hebrew names and words in them, but I also found that German and Slavic words were in the names almost as much as Yiddish ones. I could also see Yiddish occasionally in inscriptions on buildings or in the ways people's names were written, but it didn't factor in quite as much as one might think, especially because many of the German immigrants who came to the United States didn't speak Yiddish as much as the Eastern European Jewish immigrants did.
So to go back to the broader picture of the project, why is mapping important, both more generally for any group of people and for the Jewish community, but not just in America, but around the world? We have, for example, in B'nai B'rith, was present all over Europe, in Eastern Europe. I was having a discussion with somebody who was years ago who was doing some work on the history of B'nai B'rith in Poland, for example. And he was telling me about where B'nai B'rith met in these various cities. I think we had 10 branches in Poland. And in the city of Wrocław, there was a B'nai B'rith building. And I said, well, is the building still there? And he said, no, but it's an empty lot. Now, it would seem to me is that what you've done, you can apply, obviously, to many cities in the United States, and I'm sure there's a lot of interest in that. But it seems to me that given where the Jewish people have lived, particularly now, 76 years after the Holocaust, these great cities and towns. My mother and father were from small villages, but of course, Jews were very much an urban people too. How can we take what you've done and really kind of spread the word, or should I say, spread the software or the application or whatever it is that you're using to help folks in other parts of the world as well?
Yes, well, first I'd like to talk about why mapping is important or why I find it important, and then I'll talk about kind of the regional expansion. So, first, I think maps are so important, and I don't just say this as somebody who gets to study them every day. I recently went to a new city, and I found that for the first time, I was somewhere completely new, and first thing I did was open up Google Maps and to try to look for things, restaurants, the train station, things like that. I was using a map. I find that maps both are representations of the physical world, but they also help us to transverse them and they help us to know what to look for. So when creating maps, we aren't just putting down what's exactly there because some things get left off of maps, but instead we're drawing people's attention to particular things and to particular cultural and historical memories. So maps are important because they help us to hold on to things and then I mean, if I'm ever in New York, now I know exactly where to go and what to look for. Maps help us both to look at the page of the map, but they also help us to know when to look up from the map. I also think, in response to kind of the second part of the question, that this idea is very applicable across the United States. Um, for example, I'm hoping to expand the bot in the near future to the Pennsylvania area, as especially in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, which had some pretty large and robust Jewish communities around the same time. I'm hoping that other people can get involved in similar activities, though, be it a Twitter bot, a map, or a photo collection, just by looking through historical records, family records, or something that has some kind of historical, cultural, or religious component. I think, even like the former B'nai B'rith in Poland, even if it's just an empty lot now, it's very worthwhile to pay attention to such spaces to try to remember that they were important to people and to consider why they were important to people. A lot of times we feel very disconnected, especially in our present moment. And by looking towards the past and remembering that those people had motivations just like us, they had culture, they had religion, they had their daily activities, and they walked to the synagogue down this street. Now, in an era where we might not feel so close to the people of the past because things are so different, we can still remember that we have motivations. We walk down the street to get to synagogue, we walk down the street to get to work. And even if it's a different time, it's the same place and it's worth it to commemorate that.
Well, let's go back to New York for a second. There was Brooklyn, there is Brooklyn, and the Bronx. Um, I'd like to give you an assignment if I could. My grandfather, I was told by my grandfather was part of a synagogue, and I suspect that he probably was also a member of a Landsmannschaft. But the synagogue was Congregation Anshe Segula in Brooklyn. And I've looked in all of the sources, in the traditional research sources, and I haven't really come up with very much. So, are you planning on going into Brooklyn and the Bronx, Queens? Um, what's next in New York?
Well, I would absolutely love to do those. My one reservation is that Brooklyn is quite complicated. Around the turn of the 20th century, the city planners in New York realized that the way they had numbered the streets of Brooklyn was done very poorly. They realized there were lots of duplicates. And so one night, in the dead of the night, they went around and they renumbered all the streets, renamed a bunch of them, and you'd wake up, you'd go downstairs, check your door, and they had papered a new address on it. Because of this, it can be very difficult to transfer or to kind of travel through the records of Brooklyn. This is, if you are ever planning a city, please do a very good job the first time to preserve the sanity of future historians. But that being said, Brooklyn is still a very, very useful place to learn about, and there are other ways to go about it than the one I've done. So I'm hoping to, with the right perseverance and attitude, someday get through Brooklyn. But I think that the Bronx and Queens would be a bit easier to do in the meanwhile.
Well, that's good. I'm thinking of something we haven't touched on, but it would be interesting to understand. Kind of touched on it in the beginning, I guess. Why is this project important to you? As you mentioned, you're not Jewish. You're from Texas. You've never been to New York City. Again, what is the? You could have chosen churches. You could have chosen social organizations. I mean, there would have so many different things in American civilization, American culture, to track down. Why is this important to you? And do you see how we are reacting, how important it is to us?
That's exactly why it is so important to me because I have seen over the past 6 months how important this is to so many people in the Jewish community. But before, when I was just getting a start on it, it was important to me because I found it so interesting. The sheer amount of records that people had kept, the sheer amount of love and care that they had put into the preservation of these spaces really drew me in. And I have seen how this kind of care and this level of attention has persisted through the centuries.
So, what's in the future for you and for this project? the Yiddish part of your studies intrigues me because when you follow that path, it just opens up worlds of culture that are it's immense. It's clearly a field of study in itself. Yiddish studies, Yiddish language, Yiddish culture. So, what do you see for yourself, having created this? What do you think your career path is going to look like?
Well, I first am going to talk about the short term of what this project is doing with me, or what I'm doing with this project, and then we can delve a little more into the long term. So, first, in terms of Yiddish studies, I love doing my Yiddish Duolingo every day, and I love trying to read short stories and poems in Yiddish and just continuing my Yiddish education in general. Um, I've also been able to do one or two pretty interesting things from this project. Shortly after the JTA article was published, a rabbi in Scranton, Pennsylvania reached out to me and let me know that he had a very interesting photo collection. For the past 30 years, he has been taking photos of synagogues throughout, especially the northeastern United States, but peering down even a little bit into the south. Like I talked about earlier, there are several books and compilations of Jewish records where they have the address, the name of the congregation, and a few other select details. And Rabbi Krautworth, who lives in Scranton, has been going down through the list and photographing all of them. And I found that amazing. And it has been such a labor for him. And I mean, it is obvious that he has put decades of work into it. And so I had the opportunity about 2 weeks ago to go down to Scranton. His photograph collection was entirely, or for the most part, analog. It was all printed out photos because he began in the 1990s. And I, with my history major know how, had the opportunity to scan these photos and make a digital version of them. So, because of this initial synagogue project that I worked on, he was able to reach out to me, and we're hoping that he will be able to publish or share these historic synagogue photos of all of these synagogues that are not synagogues anymore. I've also been able to reach out to people um, about similar topics, and so it's been really amazing seeing where this project has taken me and the kinds of people interested in history that I've been able to connect with. And
Well,
then, sorry, go ahead. I would
no,
like
go,
to talk
go
more
ahead. I
about
was
what
just
you
saying,
have to say.
I suspect, I mean, just this is the story of one rabbi, but I suspect that as your story and the article, of course, did help, but as this story becomes wider and more widely known, I can just think of a line of people with similar kinds of ideas or project ideas that they'd like to share with you.
Yeah, it really has been amazing. Like I said before, people have sent me poetry and short stories about their Manhattan synagogue that they went to as a child, and I have really enjoyed that, and really enjoyed hearing people's genealogical ventures, hearing people like yourself say, "Here's where my grandfather went. Can you help me find this?" And that has been very, very fun for me, but also very fulfilling. I really like to help people with those. And so I think in terms of the long term, I'm like any junior in college, not sure what I want to do with my life yet, but it has been a great honor and very interesting to work in genealogical and historical studies. And so I'd love to work in the field of public history and outreach and help other people work and look at where their families used to live, the ways their family used to live, and sometimes even who their families are. That's part of how I got into being a history major and doing this project in the first place, is working with my own father and grandmother on my genealogy. And therefore, I would love to be able to help people with that in the future. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do that or how I'm going to get there, but I'm excited to find out.
Well, final question. Um, what would you like uh, people to walk away from this project with? Those who learn about it, what would you like them to think? Would you like them to think that their search for roots has now been made somewhat easier by what you're doing? That the technology that you work with really augurs well for the future? I mean, what's the takeaway for folks who learn about this project?
Well, Dan, I'd like to hope that I made it just a little easier by exposing people to the bot and by showing people what you can do with historic information. A couple takeaways. I am really grateful for the Center for Jewish History's compilation of much of this data in the first place. They have a fantastic genealogical network. But the other takeaway I think is a little more ephemeral for me, and that is that I think upon hearing about this project and learning about it, I would like to encourage you not only to think about your family tree and the people who compose it, but also the places where they lived. Many of us are far away from where our ancestors lived, and this could not be more true, especially in the field of Jewish genealogy. And considering where your ancestors lived, how they lived, the customs they practiced, and how it related to the world around them can give you a better sense of connection in this time. Just to do that for your family and even in the place where you live now, like I live in Texas, I live on Krakauer land, thinking about not only did this used to be a synagogue, but what did this used to be? Who used to live here? And in what ways can I be respectful to them? And hope that other people do the same for your family in a different place. I would encourage people to be more connected and plugged into their genealogy and to the histories of those around them.
Good advice. Well, check out Amy Shreeve's work at Old Shul Spots on Twitter and at amyshreeve.github.io/portfolio. Well, Amy, as they say in Yiddish, a große Dank. Thank you again for joining me and sharing what you've learned from delving into the various congregations and organizations that once dotted Jewish New York. Wishing you nothing but success and looking forward to seeing your exploration of other Jewish communities down the road.
Thank you, Dan. Shannon Donk.
Thanks again to Amy Shreeve for being with us and talking about her project, This Used to Be a Synagogue. And of course, to all of our viewers, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel, liking us on Facebook, and following us on Twitter and Instagram. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. For my guest, Amy Shreeve, and for B'nai B'rith, I'm Dan Mariaschin. Thanks again for being with us.